The 27th of June, the Ukraine Media Center is on air. Your anchor is Svetlana Cheperenko. We are talking about the Middle East conflicts and the way it can affect the situation in Ukraine and the Russia-Ukraine war. Our guest is Vadym Denysenko, the head of the Business Capital Analytical Center. Welcome, sir. It is always exciting to follow the wars in other places. But this is not a foreign war to us because it is affecting the situation in Ukraine. This is the focus of today's talk. The war between Israel and Iran involves the issues of political things and oil and uranium and arms. What do you think is the way this conflict will affect the situation in Ukraine? This is a very wide-ranging issue. With your allowance, I will begin with a short presentation to be followed by other details. Where should we start? We all understand that, indeed, in spite of all the information, major warfares we are seeing, and in your information bubble, you are always a winner. Either you are in Tel Aviv or in Iran's capital. We should be very aware of the following facts. The regime, such as in Iran or in Russia, will fall only under the serious street protests, implying a strong leader or an ideology, and a must there is the availability of the traitors within those regimes or the international silence. As of now, we are not likely to see any major street protests. As far as I can say, the major problem of Israel and the United States is that they don't have adequate leaders of opposition to lead the street protests under some slogans. What they're doing good at is the traitors within the regime, because with the number of generals killed and the specialists in physics science, it also tells us how many traitors they are having or were having. But the question is whether this will impact the opposition and the street protests. There is no clear answer to that. Again, to reiterate, because there is not a serious situation with street protests. The stalemate is what we see in Iran. Israel wanted to continue this war to bring down that regime. That regime is still standing. United States can do, but is not willing to do so. The Iranian powers that be have been staying in their bunkers, meaning that they're only interested in their survival. China is watching this from a side. China does not need any major war. At the end of the day, Russia is choosing between a partner and an opportunity to be liked by Trump. Putin will opt for the latter. This is the stalemate situation that we are seeing. When people talk about tomorrow's beginning of the combat actions, will Mossad be following the specialists in nuclear science? They will. Political associations will be seen. However, the major issue is this: A, whether we have people in Iran able to lead these protests. This is an open question. This is what Israel is likely to be working on. And B, the question is whether the regime in Tehran ready to regroup and fight the strength within itself to change the situation. I don't think they will be able to change themselves. In other words, when Israeli Prime Minister called for a revolt among the Iranians, And the Iranian president is claiming that we can find a democratic solution there hiding in the bubble. Correct? Yes. On the footsteps, what we are seeing is that there are changes introduced to the local criminal code where the norms, regulations are much stricter, and of course in Iran they will begin the witch hunt to see where the traitors are coming from. This is a corrupted regime, and this is a systemic problem, a managerial challenge that will not be solved by specific issues. They can in jail 1 or 2 or 3 persons. This will not be the end game. The second point that must be followed on, the stabilization in the Middle East opens the space for the negotiations between the United States and the EU. These negotiations began yesterday at the NATO summit. This is where we can say that after that situation has been stabilized for a number of months ahead in the Middle East, de facto we are seeing the launching of the key negotiations between United States and EU. And that matters for Ukraine because, one, we're talking about customs, the security issue, and third point is Ukraine per se. This is a negotiation triangle among EU, US, and Ukraine. When we are part and a major part of a negotiation process, what we should be mindful of in these negotiations. These talks foresee a couple of points. One, there is a situation when today's trade balance between U.S. and Europe is where United States in the red. The Trump administration wants to minimize such a negative trade balance and pay as little as they can. What is the shared point among these through points? One, Trump will seek the European Union to purchase American weapons with a very great amount of money. The communique of NATO that stated that NATO members will spend 5% of their GDP effectively means that the EU is giving concessions to United States and will buy a lot of American weapons. Second point that the United States is seeking to do is unconditionally the transfer, or rather building of high-tech facilities to be relocated to the United States from Europe. Negotiations have not zeroed in on this so far. What we are likely to see as a next point is the customs area. As for these things, what we are seeing is that it was Trump's presidential ticket, duties and customs. The Minister for Finance's Secretary of Finance plus Elon Musk suggested the setting up of the free economic zone with the customs being leveled. What is the concept that is likely to win? I tend to think that the zero customs will prevail and the free trade zone will be set up. President Macron mentioned that at the NATO summit because it was a summit to secure Trump's victory. Complex issues and questions were not discussed. As a result, if the customs are zeroed, this will effectively mean the setting up of the biggest free trade zone in the world with what matters most, a population that can afford and is the richest. What we are seeing is the great war for Europe. Both China and United States are fighting for the proximity to Europe. Those who will be close to Europe will be leading a technological war in the world. What do we receive in an exchange? Trump will exchange this for a security factor. That is, American bases will stay in the territory of European Union, the nuclear umbrella, which is sustained by the United States effectively, and the Washington Agreement fifth point, which is effectively mean the defense against the Russian Federation. Putin is needed by Trump to be frightened with, because otherwise Trump will say that you will face Putin on your own. I need him as a scarecrow. If we see, if the sanctions are intensified in the coming months, to be honest with you, and that is not very likely to happen. More to the point, currently, and I reiterate the point that Putin is doing everything not to fall out with President Trump. He will keep playing this game. It is not coincidence that after what we had seen in Iran, we know that Russia is not a reliable partner. And by playing up to Trump, Putin is opting for the accommodation of his ways with Trump. He's mentioned that Trump's victory was stolen away. That is to say, Putin wants to play up to Trump's ambitions. As far as the relocation of facilities or building them in Ukraine, what I think has been left out of this equation, it's a proposal suggested by Mr. Dmitriev in El Riyadh when the United States and Russia were having negotiations. This proposal states that everyone is talking about the tip of the iceberg. The Arctic shelf and Arctic resources will be used by the Russian Federation. We are talking about decades and tens of billions of dollars. Dmitriev has also suggested points where the sanctioned goods will be sold in the territory of the EU, including gas, oil, woods, perhaps fish, and so on. That is to say, Russia is likely to be a middleman in these trades, including diamonds. Europe is not giving way. Europe has said this will not happen. But yesterday's news that there will be a tribunal against the Russian leadership, this has buried the whole proposal, but the proposal is still there. Trump is likely to see this as a lucrative way to make a lot of money. Meanwhile, he wants to be a broker in the Russian trade flows. I mentioned that Russia is needed currently by Trump for these negotiations. To repeat, Putin is needed by Trump as a scarecrow for Europe to be more friendly. What we know about these negotiations? First point, 90%, we can be sure that the so-called Denysenko law will not be enacted until the fall of 2025. No earlier than September or October. We should understand that this bill that is so much talked about here in Ukraine and so much liked here has a number of weaknesses. I will pinpoint one, which I think is very important. If we see a miracle tomorrow and this bill is passed as a legislation, this will worsen the relations between USA and India, effectively putting a stop to American-Chinese negotiations. If we see that Beijing and Delhi are restricted or banned from buying Russian oil, the issue is what will be compensated for that, and B, are they going to follow the rules of the game? There is a high probability that neither India or China are likely to play according to those rules of the game. Plus, we see that Saudi Arabia is increasing the oil output, but to replace such volumes of oil cannot be done in real situation. When we talk about the Lindsey Graham legislation, if we want this to work in one way or another, a number of negotiations must be conducted with the countries of oil-producing countries. And negotiations must be conducted with India. And third point, something that I cannot imagine. How do you say to China, you have to give up on procuring Russian oil? This is not a reality. As for the timing, it looks as follows. Negotiations with the EU, barring any extraordinary circumstances, those talks will be over in October or September or November, which is to say that a number of steps must be taken to resolve issues that I have mentioned in terms of customs and security. Here we are facing a serious threat, one of the major challenges for the Ukrainian diplomacy. That is to say, in these negotiations, Ukraine can get lost or be sidelined. This is, in other words, a major challenge and problem for Ukraine. As for the NATO summit that was concluded yesterday, it has demonstrated, one, there is a coalition ready to finance the Ukraine's purchases of weaponry. United States has agreed that those 5% of GDP expenditures include the weapons for Ukraine. As far as I can understand, in his talk with President Zelensky, President Trump, if not he has committed to, but he has not opposed the issue of Ukraine purchasing U.S.-produced weaponries. I think this will be effected within the negotiation process. But again, we are dependent on EU, we are dependent on the USA, and to be sure, one of major issues for Ukraine in these negotiations is not to get lost. This is the problem that we will be facing in the upcoming months. As for the Putin and the negotiation process in a bigger framework of US, EU, Ukraine, and China, Putin cannot stop this war due to a number of reasons. His goals have not been achieved. Let me remind you that, from my point of view, the reasons for starting this war was that this will be a blitzkrieg, and Putin will be a third major power in the world. He thought that such a victory will grant him the functions of the policeman of the world, and not only to occupy Ukraine, but also to get other countries such as Armenia, into his orbit on influence. Georgia, seemingly so close to Russia, is seeing a number of processes. We have seen the news today that the logistics of the goods of parallel import going through Georgia has seen a number of barriers. It relates not only to Georgia, but to that region in general. Third point is that Putin thought that a number of millions in Ukraine, plus Belarus, was supposed to stop the process of national dilution of Russia. We see what is going on in the Ural region in Ukraine, where the migrants are supposed to be replaced with the migrants from other countries, starting with Nigeria, ranging from Nigeria to North Korea. The second point is this: 25% of the ultra-patriots that is a base for Putin's regime. Those 25% do not know now how to stop the war. They want to continue fighting. What to do this with this proactive, aggressive minority that can turn into the opposition to Putin? In Kremlin, they don't know the answer. Secondly, they don't know how to return millions of people from the front line who will not be paid much less money as compared to what they're being paid now. Third point is what is not talked about in Ukraine, but in Russia we see a massive nationalization or reprivatization. The major beneficiary of this nationalization are 15 families, but major beneficiaries include 6 families close to Kremlin: Rotterbergs, Kirienko, the Sechins. In one word, these are people from Putin's entourage. These people, 100%, are not for the end of the war, because the end of the war will imply end of nationalization. For these families, what matters is this. One, in Russia, it is a taboo to talk about a successor. On the other hand, the Russian elites, because of the war and nationalization, are living within the logic of nationalization. This is an oxymoron in itself. What do they do with this? They don't understand. Plus, Putin understands and thinks that he will see a summer campaign, the offensive campaign that is, in his view, will be successful. What we see in Russia is the systemic economic crisis. It can be called cooling down or recession. It is mentioned by the Russian Federation, and not only Russian Federation. The systemic crisis is there. Apart from the crisis, the Russian authorities can allow for a year, perhaps more than a year, to finance the military base and the army. Other programs will be slashed. All this that we are seeing for the second quarter is demonstrative of the fact that what we are seeing is the decrease in production, except the military base. In the military complex, there is a relative growth, but this growth has been halted. It is explained by the fact that there is a lack of technology, a lack of labor, and the coffers are being dried out. At the same time, I believe Putin is likely to finance the defense budget, and I am concerned by the fact that there is a hint to the fact that fall will see the revisit of the budget, and that budget will have increase for the defense expenses. That is to say, this will speed up the fall of Russia, but it also means that Putin is not likely to talk about any peace negotiations. In parallel, we must understand that Russia currently is ready for mobilization. All the legislation is developed to the effect that they will see no problems in mobilizing 300,000 people, as we saw in 2022. Unlike 2022, this will be a more systemic way of mobilization. From what we can judge now, North Koreans, have refused to provide military conditions for this war. It might be explained by the impact of China. That is to say, Russia was asking for 50 to 100,000 personnel, but North Korea has turned it down. What North Korea is likely to transfer is a couple of thousand of people. Either they will be in the combat line or in the rear, but this is not an amount of personnel that Russia was seeking to get. In theory, what can stop Putin? In theoretical terms, I mentioned that Lindsey Graham bill is very difficult to be implemented. And indeed, Putin is afraid, and is afraid in a big way, that Trump can begin to block Russian export of oil in parallel to the negotiations with the Middle East, China, and India. The major level of influence is the Chinese People's Republic. It is very realistic that China may be waiting for it to enter the negotiation process, and it can enter after they have been China has been asked to do that by the United States. So what we are having to follow very closely, not only negotiations between EU and US, but starting with a certain point, we should be following very closely negotiations between the US and China. Thank you, sir. I would like to touch upon the relations between Russia and Iran. During the Israeli-Iran strikes, we saw that Russia failed to support or back Iran. Why do you think that happened? If there's a scenario where Iran will realize that Russia is not a good partner, it's not only Iran. Syria has turned out to be not a coincidence. It's a trend now. Russia is not a dependent partner, neither for Syria or Iran or Kazakhstan or other countries. What the regimes can cope for that want to be friendly with the Russian Federation, the best they can do is that in a low-profile situation, Russia will support them, but when it comes down to a worse scenario, they will do what they did with President Yanukovych, of providing some living facilities for a leader that has been toppled. If Russia wants to portray herself as a leader of the post-colonial world and leading this movement across the world, effectively it has turned down that Russia is choosing between its declared goals and the state of being afraid of President Trump. This is a politically and economically important issues. Think about procurement of weaponry. The war in Iran proved that Russian and air defense complex 400 are not that dependable. But it also has shown that weaponry better be bought from a more reliable partner. For example, the military-industrial complex of the Chinese People's Republic. Russia is continuing to put together and using the stockpiles of Iranian-made weaponry, rockets, and other drones, for example, but they're not using it in the battlefield. I'm not a military specialist, so I'm in no position to answer that question. In that case, a question against the backdrop of the U.S. strikes against Iran, how will that affect the Iranian-Russian negotiations? Psychologically, it was a major blow to Putin. The strikes of the 24th of June were conducted at 4 o'clock in a.m. Is that a parallel to the beginning of the Russia-Ukraine war? I don't know. But in global terms, Trump, who has been, for the last 4 months, been portrayed as a comic figure, and that was done by the Russian propaganda, who were saying that President Trump is like a clown. But unexpectedly, for the whole world, including Russia, has turned into an unpredictable, frightening figure who can do anything. This, of course, affects the position of President Putin. Putin's desire to be liked by Putin is explained by the fact the attack against nuclear facilities in Iran is an indicator of how unpredictable President Trump can be. This will affect the policy of President Putin to be liked by President Trump. He wants to be invited to the negotiation table. Do we have questions from the floor? Thank you for this comprehensive report. In the context of what you have highlighted, if there is an awareness in China of the fact that Russia is only a lapdog of the Kremlin, is the lapdog of China, what Chinese authorities can do? Are we expecting any radical steps to shape Russia in a pro-China interests? Russia, in principle, wants to be liked by President Trump. China is interested in continuing this Russia-Ukraine war because Russia will need more and more China-made technologies. The latest report we saw was that 60% of all the robots that are functioning in the Russian Federation are Chinese-made. All the 60% of the heavy machinery ranging from lorries to other goods were manufactured in China. The only area where China is not allowed to enter is telecommunications. China was not allowed to build a 5G facilities, and it's not likely to happen this year. And so far, Russia has not allowed China to participate in software development. In other areas, China is dominating in Russia, and for the coming decade, it's not realistic to turn that influence down. Unless they see the opening of the European market for energy resources, the probability is very low. I mentioned proposals of Dmitriev. They're on the table. But unless China enter the European energy markets, Russia will be their hope for the imports of gold and petrol. From this standpoint, Russia is defending a situation that it is good for this war to go on for a year or so. There are two red lines here. First red line is nuclear weapons. And second red line is that this war cannot go beyond the Russia-Ukraine war as for the Israeli-Iranian war. So this war staying within the limits of Russia and Ukraine, this is what China wants to see. As for the further development of these events, Russia, a weak Russia, is what China needs. And China also needs a Russian leadership that can be manipulated by Beijing. Whether Russia is likely to be a vassal of China or US, no, this is not likely to happen. But Russia is technologically dependent from China for many years to come. Thank you. Do we have more questions? In that case, I have to thank you, Mr. Denysenko. We've been talking about the impact of the global conflicts and the Middle East conflict influences Ukraine. Thank you for staying with the Ukraine Media Center.